Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Beyond the Steps podcast. This is the show where we ask one question and dive in with a guest expert on a range of topics affecting performance athletes like racism, gender inequity, sex abuse and prevention, dance medicine and science, nutrition, psychology, and more. My name is Bree Zabrowski, co-founder and CEO of Apollo Performance Wear, here with my fabulous friend and co-host, Melissa McDaniel Grisham of Turning Point Dance Creations. Today, we're talking injury risk management. And I know before you all give me that groan and blah, 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 I know everybody's so over it. It has people yawning. It is so important because we're not all on the same page about it yet, and we need to be. So, we're talking today about what are the extrinsic factors we should consider as studio owners when working to reduce the risk of injury to our young performance athletes. This is a big deal and one that gets largely ignored. So to chat about it with us today, we are welcoming our friend Lauren Newby. And Melissa, tell us a little bit about Lauren.
We are so excited to have Lauren with us for the very first time. She's the first time beyond the stepper. So we are so excited to have her. Lauren is a dance teacher, choreographer, and physical therapist assistant in New Jersey. Lauren graduated from Union County College with her applied associate's degree in physical therapy assistant in 2016. She works at the Select Medical Support Center of Excellence, powered by Kessler Rehabilitation Center in Union, New Jersey. As a dance specialist for Kessler, she focuses on educational programs regarding injury prevention or injury risk management and rehabilitation for local studios and dance programs. Lauren is a member of Dance Medica and the lead of their executive education board. She's a certified point shoe fitter. Thank you, Lauren. Certified point shoe fitter.
Yes.
Stop. Thank you so much. Lauren is also a member of the National Dance Education Organization, Associated Dance Teachers of New Jersey, Dance New Jersey, the American Physical Therapy Association, and Performing Arts Medicine, and the International Association of Dance Medicine and Science, IADMS. We're also friends and partners of ours here at Beyond the Steps. Lauren is passionate about dance,
Yes.
education, and injury prevention, and hopes to pass her love for all things movement related to her students. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
We're excited to chat with you. You've obviously done a ton of work with dancers and love to focus on the topic of injury risk management. Why do you think this is such a tough concept? Because, like Ree said, we hear the groan when we say injury risk management. Everybody's like, oh. Why do you think this is such a tough concept for the dance world to specifically get a grasp on?
There's a couple reasons. The first reason is that we're just so used to getting injured, right?
Right.
When you look at the research, a lot of the research that's done on companies or small groups of dancers, and they have to define what is an injury because dancers dance on injuries all the time, right?
Yeah.
If somebody who's not a dancer rolls their ankle, they're like, oh, I got hurt. I got to stay off my ankle for a few days. Dancers are like, oh, I rolled my ankle. Let me jump on the left today instead of the right? We don't stop. And so, in a lot of the literature, injury is actually defined as something that keeps you away either from class or performance, when in reality, dancers are dancing injured all the time. We're dancing on sprains, strains, pulled muscles, things that hurt, things that don't feel great, but we're like, we can push through it. So, we have this like part of our culture as dancers where not only does it like feel good to be able to dance through an injury and kind of persevere in that sense, but it's almost like a badge of honor. And that's a problem. That's a really big problem moving forward as dance becomes more complicated, more complex, as the technique becomes more difficult, as we require more of our dancers moving forward. And so every year that things get harder and harder and harder, and we're pushing people more and more and more, the likelihood of those injuries increase as well. And so if we don't manage that, that's going to be a problem moving forward, especially for our younger dancers.
It's so funny you say this because obviously Apollo socks, that's why we created this product, right? To address the insane injury rates we were seeing in dancers, especially young dancers, that was taking them out for years. And so obviously we're an e-commerce business. We sell socks, amazing socks, check them out. But we were running an ad and one of our customers had commented on the ad, this is so unnecessary. All you need is great training. And we had responded back like, good for you. Or I was a dancer for 50 years and I've never had any issues. All you need is great training, something to that effect. And I was like, dance now looks very different than it did
50
years
years
ago.
ago.
And good for you for making it through all of that without injury. But most of us aren't that lucky. And we dancers just are not equipped with the tools or the knowledge to really protect themselves as other athletes already do. And that's the biggest problem that I see with it, is that this is important stuff that every other athlete has available to them, and our industry has not adopted it. And we need to change that. And we're going to only do that by having the conversation. So we're excited to dive into this today. So with that, Lauren, what are the most common injuries that occur at the studio level, especially for young dancers and performing athletes? What do you see most commonly happening here?
Unsurprisingly, it's foot and ankle. That's the number one most common injury. So sprains, strains, rolling them. After that, it kind of moves up into the hip, knee, and low back. Those kind of end up being a little bit even on the number of injuries, with a little bit more towards the knee. You don't see as many neck or shoulder or upper back, just because when you think about studio dance training, it's all in that lower body, right? So even though we're using our upper body all the time, especially for young dancers, or especially for female dancers, not using that low thing. So you see a little bit of a difference in the body parts, but it's almost always in that foot and ankle area, especially.
Yeah, I think that the data that we have on the Impala side is that 65% of dancers are injured 65% from the knee down, and twice as much as football players. So it is staggering when you look at those foot and ankle issues. And again, we're going to talk about all the tools to mitigate that. So throughout the episode. So I'm excited to tackle that too. How can studio owners identify potential injury risks in their facilities? Because I think, and this is a tough one, because I know it's a financial issue as well. The stuff that we're talking about today is not cheap by any stretch. Good flooring, the way that we address injuries, having our policies in place and our processes to address that. It's not cheap, convenient, or easy by any stretch, but it is an investment in having a quality program, and also offsetting the liability on you as a studio owner, right? So how can they identify what those risks are, especially if they're not very knowledgeable on this topic and they weren't taught that way?
Sure. So there's two, we said it at the beginning of the podcast, that these are the extrinsic risks. So anything that is on the outside of the dancer is considered an extrinsic risk. Anything that's inside of the dancer, like their muscles, bones, imbalances, things like that, that's intrinsic. So extrinsic is anything that's going to act on the dancer in their environment. So when we're talking about the studio, for any studio owner or teacher, it's really important to just be familiar and be vigilant, right? So, what is your floor, right? Like you said, it's a big investment to have a good dance floor, but you need to have either some kind of floating floor, sprung floor, really dance appropriate floor, because that's going to be appropriate and important when dancers are jumping, 120 times in a 1 hour class on top of a floor, right? You're going to need that spring back to help support their joints, right? But on top of having an appropriate floor, is it down appropriately? Like if it's Marley, is it peeling up? Is it taped down where it is? If it's a wood floor, are there any spots of splinters or divots, right? So really just starting with that space, right? Because as a dancer, all we need is our body and a space. So what does that space look like today, right? And that can be done for a dance teacher or a studio owner in the morning when they're cleaning, or right before their class, when you're sweeping the floor, or when you're going through picking up, whatever the last class left there the night before, just taking a look and being like, oh, is that spot dangerous? Like, is that splintering up because of, somebody's screw on their tap shoe last night? Ooh, that piece of tape on the Marley needs to be replaced, right? Whatever your floor is, and knowing your floor, looking at it and inspecting it. That's the number one piece. Same thing goes for bars, right? Most people are either going to have, the portable bars that you carry out to the center, or a bar screwed into the wall, depending on where you are. If it's screwed into the wall, making sure that that's really in there, right? You've got little kids hanging on that thing all day. I don't know about you guys, but when I took 3-year-olds, you couldn't get them off that thing, no matter how hard you tried, right? And so over time, no matter how appropriately or correctly it was done initially, it may loosen. So walking over and giving a tug on it every once in a while. Same thing for the bars that go in the center, making sure that all those joints are secure and screwed in. So a lot of it really has to do with knowing your studio and knowing the equipment that you use in your studio and making sure every day that equipment is working properly. And it shouldn't take long, right? If you're doing, creating a walkthrough in the morning or before your first class, or when you're getting a new teacher, showing them your studio and saying, when you set this out, just give it a little shake or a little test it, because the studio space is really the most important space, right? And aside from the physical integrity, thinking about things like, is the floor sticky today? Is the floor slick today, right? If it's a humid day, that floor might be a little bit more sticky. You might have trouble turning. And even though that doesn't seem like something that, should click off on us as like, ooh, that could be an injury. If they're sticking to the floor a little bit harder, and maybe they're barefoot and then they stick and then they pivot a little too much, then you're going to put a lot of torque at the knee or a lot of torque at the ankle, and there's that injury. Nobody wanted that injury to happen. No dance teacher wants an injury to happen, but they're all possible. So those are kind of the big ones, really looking at anything you're going to use in class for the day and saying, how is this looking today and right now? And do I need to make a modification? Do I need to mop the floor because it's too sticky? Do I need to sweep it? Do I need to, not use the bar today because I need somebody to go look at it?
Or, make a long-term plan to address it. Because in some cases, that's going to need to be a bigger fix, right? Like you could put a Band-Aid on something so many times and then it has to be a big fix. But what I also want to add to that is also being super honest. What's convenient is not what is always right, but being super honest with the situation. I mean, we have talked to people at trade shows and things like that when you ask them what they're dancing on, and they'll tell you they're dancing on linoleum. They're dancing on a concrete floor. They're dancing outside in a parking lot. Like crazy situations when you're asking somebody to use their body, and we're wondering why these kids are out at 12, 13, 14 years old. And that is happening, I will say, far more than what I realized it was happening. Like,
I think that was a big issue, especially during the pandemic, about like where people were dancing. So concrete floors, that's a big issue. Also, when you look at conventions, competitions, any outside performances, I've had instances where I was dancing on concrete, on carpet. I danced on a rickety stage once, covered in linoleum 2 hours after it rained. That was not fun. So what are the actual conditions, right? So when you're in the studio, it's a little bit easier to control that, right? Or make a long-term plan for it. We need to get a better floor. We need to get a sprung floating floor. But when you're taking your kids or your company or whoever it happens to be out to a performance, that's when you have less control over it and you need to prep more. Right? Are you going to do those knee drops if you're dancing on concrete? Are you going to be doing all those jumps to the floor if you're dancing on concrete? Are you going to be able to dance in your socks or your jazz shoes, or are you going to need to dance in sneakers, right? If you're dancing in sneakers, there's going to be much more friction between your foot and whatever surface you're on. So what is the plan? What are you going to do for that to create a safer environment for your dancers? Same goes with the weather and the temperature, right? We have a comfortable temperature. There's a fan. We were able to keep it like cool enough that everybody's happy, but not too warm. But if you're performing outside, or during COVID when people were practicing and having classes outside, if it's too hot, too humid, that actually becomes dangerous for the dancer as well. There's a really great resource for that. The National Weather Service has something called the wet bulb temperature. It's on their website. You can actually, it sounds really weird. It's on their website. You can look it up, and they have, oh my goodness, they use 3 different measurements to try to give people information on how safe it is to do activity outside. So it's used a lot by professional athletes and OSHA, and it gives you just kind of guidelines of how long you should be doing activities, how often you need to take a break. If there's
that's great.
So thankfully COVID's not as not out there as much anymore, and hopefully we won't be dancing outside as much. But if you do need to be outside, that is a great resource.
Exactly. There's so many extrinsic factors that we don't think about, and we've talked about floors and bars and and that, and you just talked about temperature. That was the one that was in my head. Like, okay, your heating and air system. Do you have ventilation in your studio that's appropriate? Do you need to be opening doors and windows? Like, are you recirculating old air? And then you also have to think about things like mold. Is your space like what am I trying to say? Dehumidified to the point where you're not developing mold and things like that. So there's just so much. And I want to talk about inspection, because you talked about walking through and looking at the floors and looking at the bars and all of that. I think that regular maintenance of your actual structure, and I know sometimes that's like at the mercy of a landlord, but looking to make sure, because we've had the heat go out before in winter. Okay, are we gonna dance like this? Like, the kids are wrapped up in sweatpants and sweatsuits, and it's like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, are we really gonna dance like that? So looking at your structures as well. But what about like tools? Lauren, like rollers and bands and things like that, blocks and all the tools that we use as dance educators. Do those need to be inspected as well? Or do we need to be looking for like a specific quality or specific brand, or do we just buy these things off Amazon? I guess is my question.
Sure. You can find a lot of great things on Amazon. I'm not sponsored, but you can also find a lot of great workout stuff at Five Below too. I love the little workout section at Five Below. So for a lot of that stuff, as long as you're keeping an eye on it and looking at the physical integrity of it, you're not going to run into too many issues, because a lot of it you're not putting your full body weight on it. You're not putting somebody else's body weight on it. If you're using a foam roller and it gets a little oval, like, yeah, you should get a new one, but like, it's not going to cause an injury. It's not going to collapse on you. Now, something like a therapy ball, like the big balls, those generally we sit on, we roll on, you put your full body weight on them. I would definitely recommend making sure that you're looking at a brand that has been tested for whether or not it's going to pop testing, stuff like that. So something like that, where you're potentially going to put your full body weight on it, looking at a better brand and making sure it's has really good integrity to it. TheraBands specifically, and not necessarily the brand, but any kind of exercise band. Brand doesn't necessarily matter. They're going to have different weights. They're just working like an elastic band. You can even use just a regular rubber band to exercise sometimes. But inspecting those every time before you use them. Anytime there is like a little bit of a crack or a tear, they should get thrown away. They're definitely going to rip at that point. They're cheap enough, thankfully, that you should be able to easily replace them. Anything that looks dry or doesn't feel like it has the same elasticity definitely needs to get replaced. And specifically with exercise bands, when you're working with them, it's really important to remember that the manufacturers of most bands recommend that you don't pull it more than twice its length. So many of them will actually go very, very far, especially those lighter weight ones will pull very, very far, more than twice its length. And once you pull more than twice the length of, say I have a section this big, I'm going to pull it to this far, but I can actually pull it that far. Once you pass that double the length of it, it's going to start to lose integrity, and maybe it's not going to snap on you, but the probability of that increases substantially. So making sure that you're using whatever it is you bought appropriately is also really important, because we like to get really creative. Dancers get creative with our props and our toys. So just making sure that you're following whatever the manufacturer's guidelines is important.
That's super, super good information. And we don't necessarily have to delve into it, but I do want to say this just as a judge and watching at dance competitions, please be careful with your props. I have seen props that are built by our absolutely and amazing, wonderful parents and put together on stage with screwdrivers and drills in like 2 minutes, collapse or not have the integrity that they're supposed to have. And that can also be very, very dangerous. So I would definitely say watch that as well. If you're just now joining us, we are here with Lauren Newby talking about the role of, our extrinsic factors in injury risk management and how we need to make sure that we are considering those when we're working to reduce the risk of injury in our performance athletes. If you have not caught this episode from the beginning, you can watch the entire thing from the beginning on YouTube at Apollo Performance or at TP Dance Creations. Please like, please share, please comment. We want to know exactly what you think. We want you to be a part of the conversation. Go ahead, Lauren.
for a second. Let's go back to, you said props. Let's talk about props, costume, and shoes for a second. Because, big props, absolutely. Little props, kids are running around hitting each other with them. You got to be careful. Costume is something that we don't often think about as a risk factor for injury. But it really does exist, right? Especially when you have really long skirts.
I believe it. Yeah, I believe it. Some of the costumes you see are hazardous.
If it's slippery and you're doing floor work, you need to be very careful. Unfortunately, I had a student get a concussion because she was laying back and she slipped and her head fell backwards. And again, that was a move she'd done for months and months and months. Everybody looked at her. She's safe. She understands it. She knows it. She had good training on it. And in the moment, in the performance between her costume, because it was slippery, the floor, because it was marly and also slick, and her excitement, it was just too much. So that kind of goes back to Bree, what you were saying, like, you need to have good training. Well, she was trained appropriately and she knew what was going on, but it was just a tough moment that happened. But also the shoes. Are you wearing socks? Are you wearing jazz shoes? Are you wearing heels? Is it appropriate for your dancer to be in that specific shoe on that specific floor? And as well as point training, is it appropriate for your dancer to be in point shoes? And are you recommending point shoes at an appropriate time? And are they being, appropriately monitored when they're first starting point? I think most teachers do that, thankfully, but, it has to be said, point shoes are dangerous. Heels sometimes can be dangerous.
Listen, I will tell you, it is very hard for me to sit here. I'm going to wait till the end to do, I cannot have this conversation today without talking about Apollo socks. But I will say, if you are a studio owner out there, know what you are putting on their feet. Dance footwear is not supportive. Period. End of story. I will debate it all day, a million times with you all. Like, we can have the conversation, email me. We'll talk about it. It is not supportive. Dance socks in general offer no support. So make sure you research and understand the difference between something like Apollo's versus a regular dance sock, and why it's important to know the difference and distinguish, and what the effect on the dancers are. Protection and support is very different than just aesthetic and sliding around.
And that's a problem too, because we look at our aesthetic and we say, this is what we want it to look like visually, right? And especially when you're teaching young dancers want to please their teachers. They want to please their choreographers. They want to get good scores. They want to have a great dance wherever they're performing. And so they're less likely to say out loud, this sock isn't working for me. It's too slippery.
No, or this decision. Yeah, this decision, absolutely. This one, this topic today really rests on the shoulders of the studio owner. And we say it all the time, like, look, we understand, like, there's a lot of hats that we all wear and the job is extremely tough, but this responsibility is absolutely one on the studio owner, from what they're wearing, dress code, the equipment, the studio facility. It is that is the responsibility. And it's important that we recognize that.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, Melissa. Go ahead.
Yeah, we definitely needed to go back to that for sure. Studio owners, Lauren, you're in the studio. Bree's been in the studio for many years. I'm still in the studio now. Time is a commodity. It is very in short supply. But we have to make sure that we are training our staff to be able to use the equipment and to inspect the equipment. How do we make sure that our staff is adequately trained? And what's your advice on making the time for that?
Yeah. So again, thankfully, dance doesn't have a ton of equipment. We're not walking into like a gym full of machines or anything like that. We've got a floor, we've got a bar, maybe we've got some props like yoga blocks or things like that. I think the first thing is to make sure that your teachers, first, when you get to know them, all of the certifications that they have or whatever training they have in certain areas, because you don't want somebody who's not trained in yoga or not trained in Pilates to be teaching those things, not even with necessarily the equipment. If they're not making the right corrections, that's a little bit of an extrinsic factor, right? If you're not being corrected, if you're not in the right position and somebody's monitoring you, that's a risk for injury, even though that is a little more on intrinsic. But anyway, it's just kind of like I said, getting into a routine when you're opening up the studio for the day, taking a walk around, jiggling whatever you're going to be using, looking at it, being familiar with the manufacturer's guidelines. I'm trying to think if there's anything specific that I can think of that I would be concerned about in a dance studio. Because a lot of it is the therapy bands, therapy balls, yoga blocks, that kind of thing, where hopefully if there's a problem with the integrity of it, it's going to pop out pretty fast. And that's going to be something that somebody can see without any kind of training, right? You're going to see a crack in a ball. You're going to see a tear in a band. And then you just don't use that for today. And you either talk to your studio owner, or if you're a studio owner, it either needs to just be replaced, or potentially if it's a bar or a floor, be addressed from a more, construction kind of place. Is there a specific thing you're thinking about though? When it comes
talk about tricks, and tricks is a big topic in the dance world, and specifically in competition, but training for those tricks, right? I mean, we're doing it on stage without any of the equipment that we have in the studio, but then in the studio, do you have the proper equipment and protocols in place with your staff in terms of supporting that student as they learn those skills and tricks?
Particularly acro, you've got the
but I think
strap,
I don't know how everybody else feels about it, but I feel like oftentimes there are acro teachers that maybe are not
acro teachers.
And that's the thing about dance, is like there really isn't a certification for anything that you're required to have to teach anything in dance. And so we have to be really careful, because that liability still rests on the studio owner.
This is a huge topic for me, because I was born in 1983, so I grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s, where acro wasn't really as integrated into dance as it is now.
You're right.
And even now, I'm not a tumbler. I can do a cartwheel, I can do a forward roll, that's about it, right? Like that's all I got. So when it comes to that, number one, I'm really surprised when I see all of that in dance, because to me, that's just, whether or not I feel like it belongs in dance is a separate issue. But
that's a whole nother day. That is a whole nother day.
So the number one thing, and you already touched on it, is what is your teacher's training? Because right now I could pull up my phone and we could look at TikTok, and TikTok will tell you, here's how to get your 540, and here's how to get your back walkover, and here's how to get your back tuck in 3 moves. And like, you definitely do not get a back tuck in 3 moves. You're not going to get that in 20 minutes in the backyard. So, as acro is not necessarily my specific area of specialty, I work with people who have gymnastics and cheer specialties that I would definitely reference to in that area. But making sure, number one, you have all of the safety equipment you would need, mats, the belts, spotting, things like that. That takes us to it. Where are you going to perform these things, right? If you're in a studio with a mat, with a belt, with a spotter, you really better make sure that kid is really prepared, or that dancer is really prepared, just on the floor, without the belt, without the spotter, without the sprung floor, to go do it on a concrete stage somewhere, right? That's number one. How often are you making them do that on that concrete floor? Because if they're a gymnast, they're doing it on that really bouncy sprung, floor. And that's a huge difference between a studio floor, and then another huge difference between, a really hard stage, or a concrete floor, or, a performance out at a fair somewhere. So that's number two. Number three, I think, is sometimes we have this dance culture of bigger, better, faster all the time. And so we have this like goal of like getting all these tricks and making it bigger and more exciting. And just because you can get a trick doesn't mean somebody else can get it without much more or a much different kind of training, right? Every trick has to build on, this is how you stand, this is how you jump, this is how you tuck, this is how you roll, whatever the trick may be. And sometimes dance and dance training right now gets a little bit stuck on, ooh, you're naturally good at that. You got that really fast. Perfect. Everybody should be able to do it. And we skip those middle steps, that middle training. And it's like, oh, but you've got a cartwheel. You should be able to do an aerial. Like, no, that's not how it works, right? And so as a studio owner, I think it's really, really important to know your teachers and to really be committed to only having teachers who know how to teach these tricks properly and who know how to train and spot them properly, and to not be afraid And for teachers to not be afraid to take a step back and say, I'm not comfortable with that. That is not a safe thing. That was one of the harder things I learned as a teacher, when I was younger, to be able to go up to my boss and take a step back and say, I'm not comfortable teaching this because I don't know enough about it. But that makes you a more valuable teacher in the end. That makes you a more valuable studio owner in the end. If a parent comes up to you and says, I want you to teach my kid how to do an aerial, you can say, I don't know how to do that, but either I can find you somebody who can, or we're going to make sure she learns how to do it in a safe space, either at a gym or with a specific kind of trainer, right?
So two things come to mind with that, right? Is that this is where building, we say this over and over on the show, but building the resources and the relationships in your community and having that list of resources ready that, look, I am not skilled in acro. I can't teach tumbling, but I can get you to somebody who can, that works with our studio, that I know is really good, and maybe even have that person come in and start teaching some classes for you. There's so many ways to play that, but making sure you have that already set so that when these scenarios do come up, you have an answer instead of just saying I can't. But also, I find it so interesting that you're saying this, like, for teachers to say, no, I don't feel comfortable, I don't teach that. That is the crux of the issue with the dance world, from dancers dancing when they're injured and they shouldn't be dancing, to teachers saying, like, just no, I don't feel comfortable. That is so hard for us to do as a community, because the mentality is, if you say no, somebody else is going to say yes. And
they will.
Our position is always threatened. So it almost is this, like, full circle problem of, like, we really have to support each other in those decisions. And you have to be the studio owner that's going to respect that boundary and not threaten their position with it. You know what I'm saying? And you teacher, you have to feel safe to be able to say, I don't feel comfortable with this. Like, dancers have to say, I don't feel comfortable, without fear of penalty or retribution. So there's so many issues at hand here.
Yeah. And that's one of the other things I wanted to talk about today, is like building that studio sense of safety. Because when it comes to extrinsic factors, so much of that sometimes actually hinges on the students or the dancers being able to come up to you and say, this shoe doesn't feel right. This costume doesn't let me get all the way to the floor. The floor is too slippery today. I'm too cold. I don't feel well. Whatever those things may be, right? And I've definitely been there as the teacher, where it's like, oh my gosh, it's another week where this kid's sitting out. Like, what's going on? But if you don't create that ability for them to come talk to you, or for, if you're a studio owner, for the parents to come talk to you, or for whatever to happen in that moment, where the student feels like their safety is the most important thing, that becomes a problem. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when I see teachers get angry that students either can't be, won't be, don't feel well enough to perform. Right? Oh, this is my piece. This is for 10 people. Like, I need you to be there. I don't care if your knee hurts. I need you on stage.
Right.
I would love you to be there, but I don't want you to have a knee replacement in 10 years. Like, there has to be, Melissa, your face. There has to be like a level at which, yes, am I going to be disappointed if my piece doesn't look the exact way I want it to look? Yeah, absolutely. I have a vision. We all have visions. But if my student doesn't feel like they're safe, they're protected, they're cared for, and they can tell me that they feel like something's wrong and either they can't dance, they can't go on stage, or they need a minute, I haven't done my job as a teacher.
Right.
Period.
So the question I have is, and I listen, we're not going to solve world peace today in this conversation, but I guess the question I have, and I'm interested to know your thoughts on this, is what do we do? Because you're right. You are absolutely 100% correct. I agree with you. Melissa agrees with you. But there's a whole lot of studio owners out there that we are not on the same playing field in terms of that belief. And so how do you stand true to those values, or, and reap? It's hard to reap the benefits from that when they can go down the street and go to a studio who is super cutthroat and will put that injured dancer on and will go for that. You know what I mean? And the priorities and the values aren't the same. we're still a business. We're still a business that is driven by revenue, right? So like, how do you prioritize the safety and still compete with the other studios in your area who are not operating on the same playing field?
Well, so to me, that goes back to the studio culture of it, right?
Yeah.
And my experience is that when parents see that I care about their kid and the well-being about their kid, they get excited about that. You're always going to have a parent who's going to want to put their kid on stage no matter what. Oh, she's got a broken ankle, doesn't matter. Let her tap it out. It'll be fine because her time on stage is more important. My time as a teacher, a choreographer, a dancer, and a physical therapist assistant has taught me so much, like from both spectrums of it. And when I'm able to sit a dancer down and say, your ankle's bothering you today, I want you to sit out. If it's still bothering you next week, you've got to talk to somebody because it's going to stop you from progressing. That's a really powerful thing to say to a parent. To be able to present a parent with information that, like, yeah, I know you think your kid's being kind of annoying because their knee hurts, but like, you actually need to get it taken care of, because if you really want them to perform, if you really want them to go farther, and you don't take care of this knee problem, this ankle problem, whatever it is now, their future is going to be very different looking. Right. And whether that's an acute problem, an injury, dancers who are dealing with hypermobility issues, dancers who are on that hypermobility spectrum have a whole different set of care and warm up and cool down and things that they need to do for their body to keep themselves safe. You have to show that. And, to me, that exactly what you're saying. There's these two different schools of thought on that. You've got this like cutthroat thought about you're going to go out there, you're going to do it no matter what. That's not how I operate. I can only tell people how I think it works and how I think you're going to get better dancers, because that's how I think. And the other side of it doesn't make sense to me. To put a dancer on stage when they're injured doesn't make sense to me. To put a dancer on stage when they're not going to do their best doesn't make sense to me. To make a dancer dance through class when she's crying and her stomach hurts doesn't make sense to me. And in my experience, having that safe place for a dancer to say something doesn't feel right today, and I either I'm going to push through it, but I might need to sit down, or that it's actually the opposite. Usually I have to tell a dancer they need to stop.
I agree.
And I think that's because in my classes the kids are do feel safe to tell me things. Most of the time. Sometimes I find out after the fact they pushed through something they didn't want me to know about because they thought I would tell them to stop. But that's actually the biggest problem in dance right now. We push through injuries and potentially make them worse injuries for the future because we don't want to stop dancing, because we love it and we're passionate about it. And sometimes it's our paycheck. And, there's a million other of those biopsychosocial reasons that we push through injuries in dance. But for the most part, when you can show a dancer that you care about them and their well-being, and when you can show a parent that you care about that dancer's well-being and that you're willing to not have them perform, when you're willing to take them out of a dance so they can have the time they need to rest and recover, or you're willing to change that dance so they can do whatever their ability level is for that performance, you're going to get a parent or a family or a dancer for life, because they want you to care about their kids as much as you do.
And there is a process to it. And I will say the reason we've shifted from the term, the dance medicine and science community has shifted from the term injury prevention to injury risk management, because it is simply not realistic to expect that you're not going to see injuries in any given dance season. You absolutely are going to see injuries. It's really more in how we're dealing with it. But if you're approaching that injury collaboratively with the student, with the parent, and look, I want you to get well. I want you to be able to dance. We need to sit. You need to come up with a plan. And look, I remember having conversations with students. This heightens around competition season because they're pushing their bodies harder. They all want to compete so bad. It's what they worked for all year. And unfortunately, I've had to have many of those conversations where it's like, look, you've been rehabbing for 5 weeks. Like, we have to get this dance changed. We still have to have your team be comfortable at the 2 week, 2-3 weeks before competition. We're going to make the decision to call this or not call this. And they're, yes, it's sad and they cry, but everybody was aware from jump what was going to happen here. And I think if you just communicate those expectations and the process, and you work together to agree on that, it doesn't mean it's not going to be tough, but it'll at least be palatable.
Exactly. And it's always a question to me of, is it more upsetting to take them out now and make the changes now, or to have them come off stage and not be able to do anything and have to go get surgery or have to miss awards because they're going to the ER? Like, what is that choice there? And to me, their safety always comes first. So
for everybody just joining, this is Beyond the Steps. I'm Bree Zabrowski with my fabulous co-host, Melissa McDaniel Grisham. We're talking today to Lauren Newby about the extrinsic factors that studio owners should consider when working to reduce the risk of injury. Yes, injury risk management. It's an important topic. Yes, we're still talking about it because we have not made enough progress. So if you have not watched this conversation from the beginning, I encourage you to do so. Like, share, subscribe, and you can see on the ticker here, you can find us on at Apollo Performance and TP Dance Creations. Melissa, I did it right. So you can find this episode and all of our episodes from season 1 through 3 on those platforms. So check those out. Lauren, so we understand from all the research being done in dance medicine and science, it's not about eliminating injury, but mitigating the risk of injury. We just said that. What should studio owners do when the injuries occur? What does that process look like? What ideally is that protocol?
So when injuries occur, everybody's pretty much on the same page, right? You're going to sit down and you're going to take a break. You're going to figure out what happened, right? For the studio owner, obviously, you're going to want to notify a parent, right? Especially if they're teenagers. Teenagers don't tell stuff. Teenagers don't share information. So you're obviously going to want to tell a parent. Now, the very interesting thing that I think is going on is everybody's familiar with RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. There's a good amount of research to say that ice is not necessarily where we want to be anymore on an acute injury. Yeah, because the swelling's there for a reason. Swelling is actually going to, in certain injuries, that is bringing blood flow and all the fluids and platelets and all the stuff that you need to kind of fix that injury to an area. So the idea that we need ice right now, not necessarily the best practice immediately. However, it's kind of like when you kiss a boo-boo better. It's like, sometimes just giving that student an ice pack makes them feel a little better too. So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but there is some research to suggest that immediate icing of an injury is not necessarily best practices anymore. But I think the assessment for the studio owner, aside from making sure the child is okay, do they need to go to the emergency room? Can they just sit and wait a minute for their parent to come pick them up? Are they okay to just sit and wait for the rest of the class? Is going to be what led to that injury, right? So for the studio owner, it's going to be, were they dropped in a lift? Was there something wrong with the floor? Were they not balanced correctly in a turn? What actually led to that injury? Is it something that they could modify, or was it just a freak accident, a freak moment of, they weren't balanced correctly and they rolled their ankle? Or was it the floor was sticky and that's why they rolled their ankle? So every time that there's an injury, going back and looking at it and saying, what caused that? And what do I need to do to try to make sure that doesn't happen again? That's not always something that the studio owner or the teacher is going to be able to do. If it's, they landed wrong from the jump. Okay. They've done that jump 600 times and 601 they landed wrong. There's not always going to be a big fix for that, but that's kind of where we want to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. You said RICE is not the standard anymore. I'm like,
RICE is
what?
Yeah, they're moving. I can look it up for you in a second. They're moving to something called Peace and Love, which seems like a very long.
I hope that's not an acronym.
It is.
That's too long. Somebody needs to revise. They need to get some Chat GPT on that and revise that a little bit.
It's very long to the point where I can't even remember all the pieces to it. But basically,
who can?
Yeah. Compression is a big piece of it to mitigate that swelling, but still allow the fluids and the nutrients and the platelets to reach the area wherever the injury is. So compression, elevation, relative rest. There's no R in there, but we'll figure it out. I don't know where it stands, but just being more mobile with it. The idea that we have to stop, elevate, not move something, make it cold all the time, stop it from swelling. Actually, they're starting to see that there's some good research to suggest that that's actually going to delay healing times in some things.
Ooh.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what is it? Peace and love?
Peace and love. I can look it up for you if you give me a second, but it's
I'm gonna look it up. I'm gonna look it up while Bree.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's, rice is much easier to remember. And, like I said, the ice is actually still going to be really good for pain mitigation. So if you have an injury that's painful immediately, ice is going to help decrease that pain. But it is going to also decrease the swelling, which may potentially lead to some slower healing times. But yeah, peace and love is long. We're going to have to work on learning that one.
I need to know what it is.
Are y'all ready? Here we go.
I'm ready.
So it's peace. So you have peace immediately, and then you have love a few days after peace. So peace is protect, elevate, avoid, compress, and educate.
Oh my God.
And then and then love, after a few days of peace, your muscles will need love. And love is load, which is an active movement and exercise approach with little
load. Does it
load.
Okay.
And then optimism.
Oh no.
That's the mindset. Vascular aeration. Is that what that is? Vascular aeration, cardio workout to boost motivation and increase blood flow. And then exercise to reduce the risk of re-injury.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is not like a surgical by any means, for anything surgical or anything like that. This is for your regular, like I rolled my ankle. Oh, I pulled a muscle, right? We don't want people to be afraid of movement in those situations. So taking a little bit of a break, compression is going to help it feel better, but being really positive that like, this isn't going to last for a really long time, trying to avoid those fearful moments of like, I can never do that jump again, or I can never go for a run again. So, yeah, but it's a very different acronym.
Oh my, yeah, we got some work to do to get that more to the rice convenience. Wow. But thank you. That is definitely a new tidbit. I had not heard of that. So everybody, we are moving from rice to peace and love, from injury prevention to injury risk management. Those are the new terms we've learned today on Beyond the Steps. So really quick, and then we have to go to homework, but tell really quick some resources or some ways that studio owners can encourage themselves and their teachers to keep up on the newest and best practices in injury risk management.
Yeah. The best thing to do is to get to know the physical therapists and the athletic trainers and the strength and conditioning trainers around you. Build a relationship. I think a lot of studio owners are afraid to build that relationship because they're afraid it's going to be perceived as my students get injured. But really what you have is an opportunity to show your parents and your families and your students that we're going to try to prevent you from getting injured, right? Physical therapy isn't just about rehab. It's also about prehab and building better muscular balances within your body and increasing your ability to do the thing that you want to do. And those specific people are going to be working with research and best practices. All of them are required to have licenses, which dance teachers and teachers don't, unfortunately. They all have licenses that have to get renewed, that you have to have a certain amount of credit hours to renew. So get to know these people in your area. Get to build a relationship with a dance therapist. Get to build a relationship with an athletic trainer or strength and conditioning specialist, somebody that you can refer your students to. Because as a dance teacher, it's really not a part of our scope of practice to be able to say, you have an injury, this is how we're going to get you better, right? Or, but that is their scope of practice. And when you have a question, they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to help you out, and they're going to be able to bring you the best practices. But you can also join groups like IADAMS, PAMA, Dance Medica, groups that include all of these dance medicine specialists that are constantly talking about these best practices and the new research like Ice to Peace and Love and the things that are coming out, and learning the things that we need to know better. I would also suggest starting to follow places on social media like the Harkness Center for Dance Medicine in New York. They're one of the foremost in the field of dance research. They're always sharing dance research. They're looking for participants right now for a jump study. So there's especially now with social media, there's a lot of different ways to get connected to people. So I would definitely recommend just starting to build those connections in your community. Unfortunately, dance studios become very insular. We like to have our studios, our teachers, our students not connect with a lot of people because we are the experts, but we're the experts in dance. So build your community to help support you. And that's what's going to keep everybody at the foremost end of best practices.
Yeah, thank you. I know that you just gave a lot of things for people to do, but we like to give homework here and little bite-sized pieces of homework to kind of, so we can see progress really quickly, right? And be encouraged and get on our path in the right direction. So what is one thing, if they had to pick one thing to start with today to start making progress towards the way they're dealing and approaching injury risk management in their studio, what would that be?
Ooh, just one.
Just one.
Just one. I'm going to say that the easiest one to do is to build that 5 minutes into your pre-class ritual of looking at not only the studio, like all the equipment that you're going to use, but looking at what your plan for the day is and saying, how do I keep myself and my students the safest today? Right? So are we using the bar? Did I check the bar? Are we teaching tour jetés? Okay, so do they know how to do sauté arabesque before we teach a tour jeté, right? Did I do everything that I can do as a teacher to make sure that my class is appropriately leveled and appropriately physically safe for today? And just building in that 5 minutes of thought where you go, oh, wait, this dancer never learned how to do this, so she can't move on to the next step today, right? That's going to start to change your mindset. And just looking at it from that safety perspective as opposed to the artistic perspective, even for just 5 minutes before class, just 1 minute before class. When I got my degree in physical therapy assisting, it changed how I approached everything. So taking that little mind flip, it's going to change how you approach your teaching.
I love that. It makes so much sense. Probably a lot harder to do than we even realized, to turn on that part, that change from the critical artistic eye to a different lens, right? Thank you for that homework. We have homework for you as well. We encourage you to take our STEPS initiative. It's a 5-part online course module that's going to give you everything that we talk about on the show in little bite-sized pieces. Every module was curated by experts in their field, and it really does lay the foundation for education. It gives you resources to go on and continue to pursue it on your own. It's not everything you ever need to know, but it is a great, again, foundation on racism, gender inequity, sex abuse prevention, nutrition, psychology, and of course, dance medicine and science. I am not going to let this conversation go without mentioning Apollo socks. We created this whole entire conversation is the reason we created these socks for dancers. We're lifelong dancers. We have 6 styles that accommodate every genre, every fit preference, from barefoot dancing to wearing in your shoes to replacing your shoes. You can get them with grip, without grip. Everything is patented. You're going to get arch support, ankle stability, energy absorption in the heels and balls of the feet. Every single style is approved by the American Podiatric Medical Association, and we have 3 independent studies showing that Apollo socks reduce ground force impact on the body. So if you are struggling with quality floors, dance studio owners that have banned socks, I understand it's for a reason. Apollo socks are more than a sock. It's a benefit of the shoe, comfort of a sock. We have the grip. They are certified by the American Podiatric Medical Association. Take a look and revise your dress code. They're for recovery. They're for performance, rehearsal, warm up, everyday wear, travel, dancers, non-dancers. Everybody needs to take a look. It is a tool you need to have in your dance bag. ApolloPerformance.com. Check it out. I want you, Lauren, to tell us how people can get in touch with you. I assume you do consults with studio owners and directors and that you're available for more information. How can people find you?
I'm on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. Please feel free to reach out. I work at the Kessler Sports Center of Excellence in Union, New Jersey. I am available to come do injury prevention discussions and injury mitigation discussions and strength training discussions at local studios. Please feel free to reach out through any of my social media. I would love to talk with everybody more about this. If anybody wants to talk about anything dance, you can't get me to shut up. So
I love it. What's your handles on social so we can put that?
That's a good question. I'm terrible at social media.
It's okay if you don't.
I have them.
You have them. Okay.
Melissa's got it. You need to consult Melissa, and she'll give you your social.
Yes, I absolutely.
But everybody, we'll drop those in after the conversation. And go ahead.
Lauren is really good because she has hers pretty much, uniform. Instagram, Miss Lauren Newby. Facebook, Miss.Lauren.Newby. TikTok, Miss Lauren N. And YouTube, Miss Lauren Newby.
There we go. Thank you. See, I knew they were all closed, but I was going to mess them up.
So reach out to Lauren on social. Again, there's no reason in this time why we are not utilizing the resources available. Lauren is one of those. Make sure you reach out. Virtual world is awesome because you can connect in so many ways virtually. So if you're a studio owner struggling, you don't know where to start, Lauren is a great option for that. So reach out. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lauren, for being here.
Thank you guys for having me. I had a great time.
We look forward to having you back. You're a first timer, but no one's ever just a first timer. So you're going to come back and we're going to have another amazing conversation. Thank you to everyone who's watching the show. Again, the full episode is available on YouTube. So you're not on YouTube at TP Dance Creations or at Apollo Performance. We are turning the entire season into a podcast. We're going to go on hiatus soon, but during that hiatus, we won't leave you alone. You're going to be able to take in and binge the podcast of Beyond the Steps. So please be on the lookout for that. Join us next Friday when we're talking to Linda Bluestein, who is also a returning guest from Hypermobility MD and the Bendy Bodies podcast. So we'll talk about hypermobility, which Lauren did allude to a little bit in our show today. Until then, like, share, subscribe, comment, and do your homework. Until we see you next Friday, continue your journey beyond the steps. We'll see you then.
Bye.
Bye.